At this stage in the trial, Socrates is considering the possibility that they'll offer him a deal. The deal being that if he's willing to stop being a philosopher, to stop questioning people, that they'll drop the charges and he'll be free to go. So why does he decide not to accept this possible deal? Well, here's how he reasons. Well, on one hand, he thinks perhaps, they'll put him to death if he keeps on, talking philosophy. On the other hand, if he stops talking philosophy, perhaps they'll let him go. So here's how he reasons why he should keep talking philosophy, even if it leads to death. He contends that the fear of death is the pretense of wisdom. It's a pretense of knowing the unknown. And he claims that no one really knows if death is the greatest good. Maybe it is. And to fear death is to demonstrate ignorance of a disgraceful sort, namely the conceit that a person knows what they do not know. Now, Socrates does claim that he may be wiser than some, and that he knows a little bit of the world below, but he doesn't suppose that he truly knows. So, in terms of the fear of death, he says, well, you'd really have to know that death is bad to fear it, but he doesn't know this. So what does he know? Well, he knows, or claims that he knows, that injustice and disobedience to a better is evil and dishonorable. So he will never fear or avoid a possible good rather than a certain evil. So if they offer Socrates freedom, if he stops being a philosopher, he won't accept it. He will stick to, following the gods. Now, this includes both a moral and perhaps a little bit of, potentially, since he mentions the gods, a religious aspect as well. And it does raise the question of, obedience and disobedience, whether there is a higher authority over the state. And it's an interesting question that arises in political and social philosophy and ethics. Is there something over and above the state that a person can refer to when disobeying the state? In the case of Socrates, he does say yes, even though he believes, as he argues in the Crito, the dialogue in which he dies, spoilers, that he has an obligation to obey the state. He has a greater obligation to avoid doing what is wrong. And so this leads to the broader question in political philosophy and ethics: when a person's moral views, or perhaps their religious views, conflict with the orders of the state, who should they obey? In the case of Socrates, he makes it clear that he will do what is right if the state tells him to do what is wrong. Now, Socrates seems to make it clear that he is on a mission from the gods. So what is his mission? Well, this takes us to his Gadfly analogy. He claims, as part of his defense, that those accusing him, if they kill him, they'll be hurting themselves more than him, which seems like an odd thing to claim, because you would think that them killing him or having him put to death would hurt Socrates a whole lot more. So what's his argument that they will hurt themselves more than him? Well, he claims that if they kill him, they will be sinning against the god or gods that sent him. So what kind of gift is Socrates? Well, this is where he draws the Gadfly analogy. And a gadfly is a biting fly. Apparently hurts a lot to be bitten by one. He claims he's a gadfly given to the state by the gods, a special gadfly gift. And he brings up another horse analogy. This one's not about the horse trainer, but about a horse, of course. And in this case, the horse is not being compared to the youth, but in this case, the state, the city of Athens, is the horse. It's a great and noble steed, but also a very big steed. And according to Socrates, the large size of the horse makes the horse a little slow and, a little slothful. So it's got to be stirred to life. And Socrates is the gadfly. sent by the gods to essentially bite the state. So when the state starts getting, kind of slack, Socrates the Gadfly swoops in and bites it. And he says it's hard to find a good Gadfly. So he says they should spare him. Now this argument also raises some interesting questions, once again in ethics and political philosophy, which is this. Should people in authority, positions of power, how should they respond to those who are critical of them? Now, in the case of Socrates, his view is the criticism, of course, needs to be like true and honest and so forth and good. Obviously, no one really wants to be like insulted or have someone tell, terrible lies or attack them. But, if the critic is telling the truth and is being honest and is trying to serve, say, the good, is that something they should do? Now, typically, of course, people in positions of authority or power generally don't like people being critical, especially if the critics are correct. They'll respond to such criticism by, asserting that it's, fake news, or saying they're just lying, or they're just bad people, or just, denying it. So one ethical question here is, should there be such critics? And Socrates would say definitely yes. Then there's a question of should they be, protected? Because as we'll see with Socrates, spoiler, he gets put to death. And should they be protected in a society? Well, Socrates' argument essentially is that the Gadfly serves an essential role. And you can make the same argument today, that you need in a state, even if you have rulers that are decent, you need people who are able to criticize them and are protected in doing this. So that way they can freely raise criticisms against government. And Socrates thinks people should be grateful for this criticism. Now, clearly, many leaders and people in power and authority would not like that. But you could make an analogy to a good coach. A good coach doesn't just tell people that they're great when they're not. A good coach is honest. So you could make the argument that if someone wants to do well, to do good, they would welcome, correct criticism. Again, no one likes having lies and insults against them. But Socrates' point is not just to have someone, ranting and screaming against someone. It's to offer, accurate, truthful, honest, ethical criticism. And so that does raise, again, two interesting and important ethical and political questions, namely, should there be such criticism of those in power and authority? And secondly, should those who make the criticism and do so, with integrity, should they be protected? Now, in the United States, we tried to answer that question in the Constitution because we have the First Amendment, which is supposed to protect the press. And so concerns about freedom of press, freedom of expression, always a matter of debate. Now, Socrates then turns to the next question. Why did he stick with gadflying, that is to say, biting the state? Why didn't he go into political office? Now, this is what he argues. And this raises the broader question of, if you wish to reform the state, a state that has issues with corruption and unrighteousness, should you become part of the system to try to reform it from within, or should you stay outside and try to reform it from without? Now, the politics of Athens was far more brutal and bloody than ours. It's not that they were constantly just murdering and assassinating each other, but it was far harsher. I mean, true, we do have assassination and murder in the United States for political purposes, but it's generally not policy. It's rare, relatively rare, that people in office get, murdered and assassinated. It does happen, clearly, but not super common. So he had a legitimate concern that if he went into politics, he would have perished long ago and done no good. Why? Well, he claims that if you honestly strive against the lawless and unrighteous deeds done in a state, then you probably won't survive. And so if you want to fight for the right, if you would live even briefly, you must have a private and public station, rather than a public station. Now, jumping ahead to today, you can raise the same question. So suppose you believe that the current system is unrighteous and full of corruption. Is the better option to go within the system to try to change it, or to be outside the system to try to change it? And again, Socrates' view is from the outside, because it's safer. Now, as we'll see in the final part of the course, the anarchist Emma Goldman raised a similar question. Should you work within the system, get elected, try to change it, or work from without? And her answer was the same as Socrates, but for a different reason. Socrates essentially said if you try to fight for the good, you'd probably perish. And Goldman said if you get elected and you try to change things, either you'll be totally ineffective or you'll become corrupted. Now, this notion of trying to change the system from the outside is something that's still discussed today. For example, one fairly famous example, but probably not famous now because people forget very quickly, is the case of Sarah Palin. Sarah Palin once was the national spotlight. She was John McCain's vice presidential pick in the run against President Obama and Joe Biden. You might have heard of those guys. And Sarah Palin was the governor of Alaska. Now, afterwards, she decided to stop being governor before she finished her term, and she gave a very Socratic reason, namely that she thought she could be far more effective outside of office than within. And of course, there are those far less famous people who make similar arguments, claiming that they can't work within the system, they have to stay outside of it, perhaps, making YouTube videos critical of the state. And so an interesting moral and also practical question is, if you wish to reform the state, do you work from within or do you work from without? So Socrates tells the people that have him on trial that he's not afraid of death. He won't listen to them if they say that he should stop doing philosophy. And in fact, they should be really grateful that he's there to constantly criticize them. And then the vote comes up to decide whether Socrates is guilty or not guilty. And the vote, unsurprisingly, is that Socrates is guilty. And next we'll turn to looking at the penalty. And spoiler, of course, it's death.